I'm doing all right. You're looking well.
As a user, like it's very similar to the last time I saw you on Clubhouse.
Yeah, I shoot for consistency.
So I'm grateful for you joining in the Respondent Club. We are, and hello to everyone. This is the Respondent Club. Joining me tonight is Bret Weinstein, professor in exile and host of the Darkhorse podcast. Thank you all for joining us in the Respondent Club. I think we'll probably go for no more than an hour, maybe even less. Bret, you may leave quietly at any time. I know you have family to get to, and I may keep the room open for a little while longer. So, just to tee it up and say thank you, first of all, for agreeing to rejoin the Clubhouse conversation, Bret. What's it feel like to be back?
Yeah, interesting. Interestingly, although I do a lot of talking for a living, being back on Clubhouse is, I don't know, it's making me slightly nervous.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that. We'll ease our way into the conversation.
Awesome.
So we are going to talk perhaps a little about evolutionary theory, a shared frontier, and maybe the new book that's going to be out in September that you've co-written with this wonderful lady. I think you know her well, Heather Hying. It's called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. Where would you like to start? Should we start on the book, Shared Frontier, or a grounding in evolutionary theory for those in the audience who maybe aren't as up to speed on that as some?
Geez, I have no idea where to start. I was assuming that was the one thing I didn't need to worry about was you were gonna take the reins.
I'm taking the reins. You don't need to worry about that. So
Awesome.
we'll go with evolutionary theory. So for those in the audience who are maybe thinking, what is evolutionary theory? What is evolutionary theory?
What is evolutionary theory? Well, first of all, I should point out that there's a terminology problem, and if you think about what creatures are, they are the product of changes in genes, and we can talk about why that doesn't do a particularly good job of describing human beings in a moment. But changes in genes, most of which are totally meaningless and really not worthy of anyone's attention. The tiny subset of changes in genes that increase the degree to which a creature is fit to an environment, that is the product of selection. Those are the interesting changes, and the way that they accumulate in creatures due to the fact that we have heritable modes is what causes the process of adaptation. So, in general, when people say evolution, 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, what they really mean is adaptation, which is where all of the intrigue is. So, evolutionary theory might technically cover it all. I'm a specialist on the process of adaptation, and I'm particularly interested in the interplay between adaptations that happen at a genetic level and adaptations that take place at other levels, epigenetic levels, including culture.
So talking of culture, obviously you've been particularly last year involved with shifting the cultural dynamic with politics, with unity. Where does that stand right now, that movement or that political party?
Well, the unity proposal was a kind of proof of concept. I thought there was something that needed to be injected into the last election, and what we demonstrated was a couple things. One, that it was possible by understanding the underlying game theory of elections to enter in without destabilizing the election. In other words, in the US, we are typically assured that if you do anything other than vote for one of the major branded candidates, you will certainly do harm by electing the greater evil. And the unity proposal was a mechanism for entering into that contest without destabilizing it in a way that stood next to no chance of spoiling the election. And so, anyway, we demonstrated that that was possible, but we also demonstrated that there was a tremendous hunger for something outside of the major parties. All Americans know, whether they admit it or not, that the major parties are thoroughly corrupt. Even though their corruption may be legal, it's completely unacceptable and results in the majority of policy functioning against the interests of the public rather than for it. And so the unity movement really stands for the policy that we would have if our leaders weren't corrupted. So in the future, I think people can expect to see the unity movement broaden its scope and attempt to adjust the public's understanding of what matters and what direction we really ought to head, and to speak for those proposals that are ignored by the major parties.
Well, it's heartening to know that it's going to be continuing. Will you have more campfires?
Well, campfire is actually a concept that Unity borrowed. It's something that Heather Hying, my wife, and I have employed as a metaphor in many other contexts. And so the idea is that what makes human beings special is our ability to exchange abstractions, as we are doing right now, and to do so with high fidelity so that I can say something and I can both have high confidence that you've understood pretty much what I meant, and I can test the question of whether you knew pretty much what I meant, and then having exchanged that idea, we can parallel process it, which means if you have a different area of expertise or a different kind of insight, then we can arrive at an answer that is greater than the sum of what each of us could come up with independently. So that has made human beings evolutionarily absolutely dominant. And the point about campfire is that campfire is where human beings have traditionally done this. When the work of the day is over, when it's too dark to be productive hunting and gathering or farming, people have gathered around fires and they have talked about what matters. And what matters can be social in nature. It can be about who's doing what to whom. It can be about what sorts of puzzles have emerged in the daily work and what sorts of solutions to those puzzles might be possible. But in any case, campfire stands in for a place of collective consciousness. So the Unity movement borrowed that because, in effect, we were attempting to pioneer a new political mode.
Well, in the interest of campfires, maybe I can suggest to the audience. We'll chat for a while, Brett, and maybe if you have a question, if anyone would like to pop up on stage and ask a question, I'm going to ask that we keep it really short. So if you can say your question in one breath, and then we'll move you to the audience, and then at the end of chatting with Brett, we can maybe bring more people up onto the stage, and people can return, and then we can kind of have that community conscious conversation around a clubhouse campfire.
Yeah, we'll do
Um,
campfire right here.
Great, great. So let's move to something I chatted with you last week about, which is vaccines. Pretty contentious subject right now. I know you recently talked about it on the Darkhorse podcast. Maybe you can give us a little context about where you stand. I know you and I are both fully vaccinated throughout our lives, but we share a trepidation and uh, about this global, sped up global clinical trial that seems to have taken place. Maybe you want to explain your perspective on that, and talk about vaccination passports, and why there is genuine concern about what's going on.
Sure. First thing I would say is you would be hard pressed to find someone who is more enthusiastic about vaccines as a general concept. I think vaccines are one of the greatest successes that medicine has ever devised. You know, we could put on the same list antibiotics and surgery, but really, those are the big three interventions that are massively successful at alleviating suffering and saving and extending lives. And as Greg alluded to, I myself am probably, I don't know how many people are in this room at the moment, but I'm almost certainly among the most vaccinated people here. I'm vaccinated for things most people are not because of the requirements of travel to some of the places that I've done biological work, and the nature of that work has involved handling mammals, so I'm even vaccinated against things like rabies. So I'm really very much a fan of vaccines. But these vaccines that are currently being deployed relative to COVID, I find absolutely frightening. And what's more, I find the lack of veracity in the discussion about these vaccines counterproductive, to say the least, if not downright dangerous. So, what I would say is there are things about these vaccines which should take them out of the concept of normal vaccine as we consider whether or not this is likely to be safe. In effect, especially the mRNA vaccines that are being deployed are completely unlike any vaccines that have ever been deployed in people before. They are based on a sound concept, but the fact is we know nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, about what their long-term implications are. And there is reason to worry that they might have long-term consequences that we will wish we knew a whole lot about. So they interact with the adaptive immune system, which all vaccines do, or almost all vaccines do. But they do so in a novel way. And that means that we are making a profound intervention in a complex system, the immune system, within a complex system, the human body, within another complex system, which is civilization, in which the epidemiology of COVID is unfolding. And we can hope that the impact of doing that will be exactly as the designers of the vaccine imagine, that we will effectively warn the immune system about the nature of the spike protein, and being forewarned, we will create immunity in patients, which we seem to do, at least to the initial variants of COVID, and that the other implications will be negligible. On the other hand, there's no reason to assume that that is the case, and the accelerated way in which these things were generated is both a testament to our technological power, and it is also a live fire exercise where we are effectively hoping to vaccinate a large fraction of the human population without a good sense of what the consequences are likely to be. And there are several different areas in which somebody who understands the underlying physiology might have particular reason for concern. But in general, we should at least be acknowledging that this is a medical experiment on a scale that humanity has never seen before.
Yeah, you and I both share a concern. I know recently you had, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, Gert van den Bosch, who is a doctor of veterinary medicine, and he specializes in virology and vaccinology, and he's worked in the industry of the construction of vaccines for quite some years. And it was an illuminating conversation. I find myself, I don't know about you, Brett, but I find myself in this predicament of having always fully vaccinated myself. And yet here I am feeling almost like a social pariah when I keep hearing people say, oh, I've had my second shot, I've had my second shot, I've had my second shot. And I don't want to have the shot. Um, I mean, what did you learn from Gert when you talked with him? Did he change your mind, or did he just, was it more convincing, the evidence that he gave you from his expertise?
Well, I had two significant conversations with Garrett. One was on Darkhorse, and that's available to everybody. The other was beforehand, and I wasn't going to put him on Darkhorse if I wasn't sure he was making sense. And in fact, there have been a number of different things that have come along during COVID that sounded frightening, and upon closer inspection, were not worthy of the discussion. But Garrett was a different story. Garrett A starts from a position of deep knowledge, and like us, he's also an enthusiast of the technology of vaccines. And in principle, he's even an enthusiast for the technology being deployed in these vaccines. But his point which, I'm in the lucky position of having enough background in immunology to be able to assess what he's saying, his point is perfectly valid. Now, I can't say that his worst fears are going to be realized, but what I can say is that his argument makes sense, and it does give real reason for concern. His argument effectively is that these vaccines would be marvelous potentially if we deployed them in advance of a confrontation. So if the virus had gotten loose on one continent, for example, we had halted travel and vaccinated people on another continent before the confrontation with the virus, then we would be in much less danger. But as it is, his point is lots of people are going to have confrontations between a partial immunity and the virus, and that is actually a recipe for enhancing the virus's capacity, basically selecting for escape mutants that are not going to be spotted by an immune system of a person who's been vaccinated and potentially not be spotted by the immune system of a person who's had COVID. So if, in effect, we could start driving the evolution of SARS-CoV-2 in a way that would cause it to become worse and less controllable rather than causing it to disappear.
I remember a year ago thinking that this natural origin consensus was baloney. And I think you tweeted recently or said something on social media about that we've wasted a year finding the courage to simply confront the facts. What do you see the facts as right now on this Tuesday, May 11th, with regards to that?
Sure. Well, I should say, I did tweet that recently, but I also had a conversation with Yuri Dagan in June of last year. I put out a flowchart, I believe, in May, and even back then, I thought the chances that this virus had a natural origin were less than 10%. The world is now catching up to this. Some knowledgeable people have put the chances of a natural origin at less than 1%. I'm not quite there, but let's just say what has been obvious from the beginning is that there is an absolutely massive coincidence that the emergence of this virus in Wuhan is a stunning fact in light of what is being studied in Wuhan and in light of what is not available in nature around Wuhan. So the bats in question aren't there, wouldn't have been active in the winter, but the viruses in question were under study at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the modifications that we see in SARS-CoV-2 relative to its wild counterparts are things that were being done by the Zhengli lab at the Wuhan Institute. So we do not have proof that this virus escaped the lab, but what we do have is really conspicuous circumstantial evidence that points in that direction. We also have the fact that Xi Zhengli herself, the head of the lab, reports that she was sleepless for nights after SARS-CoV-2 was discovered in Wuhan, fearing that it might have come from her lab. So we know that that's plausible. And then we have other kinds of evidence that also point in this direction. So I would say that there are four general categories. One is the circumstantial evidence surrounding the Wuhan Institute and the behavior of these labs in the aftermath of the pandemic's emergence. But we also have molecular evidence. So there are things about the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 that are conspicuous. We have phylogenetic evidence, the fact, and this is sort of a hybrid between molecular evidence and phylogenetic evidence, but we have sequence anomalies that are unknown from this subfamily of viruses that massively increase the infectivity of this variant relative to its wild counterparts. So the bat viruses that are most closely related lack what's called a furin site. A furin site is a cleavage site that causes SARS-CoV-2 to be very capable of invading human cells with an ACE2 receptor. And so the fact that that furin site is known in nature but is not known from any other beta coronavirus is quite telling. The spelling of the furin site is also conspicuous. It is also anomalous for coronaviruses. And so, anyway, we have the phylogenetic evidence, we have the sequence evidence, we have the circumstantial evidence, and finally, we have epidemiological evidence, which is, in my opinion, some of the strongest, where what we have is a virus that appears on day one to have been marvelously adapted to move from one human to the next. And typically, if a virus had moved from something like a bat to something like a human, what you would have instead of a marvelously pre-adapted virus is you would have a period of evolution in which a clumsy virus learned the trick of leaping from individual to individual rather than knowing the trick already. Now, of course, the most obvious way that a virus could have learned this trick at the point that it emerged is it could have been trained to do it in a lab, which is consistent with what the lab in question appears to have been studying. We can tell that from their publication record and from their interactions with colleagues in the US and elsewhere. So what I'm getting at is none of these lines of evidence in and of itself is conclusive. And taken together, they are still not absolutely conclusive. But I would say we are well above a preponderance of the evidence pointing towards a lab leak, and we are heading on towards the vanishing of reasonable doubt.
Thanks, Brett. And I just want to just reset the room for a moment. This is the Respondent Club with Bret Weinstein. And if you have a question for Brett, I'm going to bring people up within the next 10, 15 minutes. Please ask the question in one breath, then you'll be moved to the audience. But then after that, we'll bring everyone. You can come back up to the stage, and we'll have kind of a campfire conversation. Brett, who do you and Heather Hine, your wife Heather, where do you look for trusted sources of information? Because it was quite clear early on. I don't know if you concur, although I think you do, that trusting the WHO, the CDC, Dr. Fauci. Let me just ask you, where do you look for your trusted information?
Well, I would say I think the one thing that all of us who are trying to navigate this as honest brokers are discovering is that there is no source. The best you can do is find somebody who seems to parse the evidence as an honest broker, either does not have conflicts of interest or is very straightforward about what they are and what they might be, and it is especially useful if the conflicts of interest run in the opposite direction of the argument that they are making. So I wish there was some answer that I could give you, but I think part of why people are tuning into the Darkhorse podcast is that they get to watch Heather and me wrestle with the fog of pandemic in real time. We do so with a kind of training that is unusual, so people do not immediately think, well, we really need an evolutionary biologist on this one, but they probably should, because it's as relevant to the analysis as a history of manufacturing vaccines or studying epidemiology. It's not more relevant, but it's as relevant as those things. So anyway, there is, I wish there was some place I could point you. I will say this week I'm wrestling with the fact that I'm able to observe the sociology of how the Overton window is moving on this question, where, it was for many months extremely perilous to talk about the obvious evidence that pointed in the direction of a lab leak, right? That was indicative of some sort of moral or political defect in the minds of many. Today, that's not true. Why? Because Nicholas Wade has stepped into the discussion, and he has, in large measure, he did a very good job in writing his article from last week, but he did not unearth new evidence. What he did was say what many of us had been pointing to with the authority that comes with having been at the New York Times. And so I guess I would say I'm maybe deeply troubled to note that what's really changing is people's comfort. And the evidence was strong, but this could easily have died and been dismissed as permanently as a conspiracy theory wrongly because because the people who are understood to be authorities never found the courage to say what they knew.
Yeah, I know. It's very concerning. I do want to move us to talk about a little about the shared frontier, but there's a lot of hands raised, Brett. So maybe we can have a couple of people come up, ask a question about COVID and the vaccine, and I just ask that everyone ask a question in one breath. And in the interest of full disclosure, ask the question. I'm going to move you down into the audience, but please stick around. You're very welcome to come back onto the stage uh, as we progress through the conversation, so we can have more of a campfire conversation. Uh, I see George down there, George Ellis. George, it'd be great to have you up on stage with a question.
Hey guys, Brett, Greg. Greg, I'm loving the conversation so far, and I like the full disclosure you gave. I like that style. I'm super pleased with it. Brett, I just got one quick question, and I want to send you an article from Science in your DMs if you can check it if you want or not. Uh, we've got some good data that suggests that the mRNA vaccines are very strong against both the UK and South African variant as well as the P1 variant out of Brazil. We've got several articles published in the last week to 10 days, two in Lancet and one in the New England Journal of Medicine. And Kristen Drustin, who's my favorite expert on coronavirus in the world, says that one of the things that we're seeing is what's called convergence. And you'll know what that means, and you can perhaps explain it to the audience. But it means that the
George,
variant,
one breath.
sorry. Yep. So I just want to say to your question about sort of, does that give you hope that we'll sooner have our hands around it than not, given the convergence of variants that we're seeing? Sorry, Greg. That's it.
Well, that's a good question. I'm in the weird position of rooting for the vaccines in the strongest possible terms while fearing what they might do. And I guess I would probably bet fairly heavily in the direction that COVID has not delivered its final blow on the basis that evolution is a very powerful force. And stupidly, we did not take this seriously enough early on, right? If we had dealt with this when it had infected a far smaller number of people, it would effectively have a much reduced canvas on which to paint. By allowing it to get so far out of hand, we have created many, many opportunities for it to learn tricks that we don't see coming. So even if you had effectively all of the known variants susceptible to the vaccine, it only has to figure out the trick once somewhere and escape our notice long enough. And in fact, are we even prepared to do the necessary right thing if we were to discover a variant that was completely indifferent to the vaccine status and the prior COVID infection of patients? Probably not. My guess is we would react too slowly and it would again escape and it would again have a very large canvas to paint on. And so you can end up playing that game for a very long time. There's also a question, and it's I'm sure beyond the scope of what we can talk about well, at least in this room, but one of the things that Gerrit Vanden Bossche is very focused on, and I think rightly so, is the interplay between adaptive immunity, that is what we create with vaccines and what is triggered by the disease itself, and innate immunity, which is the immunity that we have before we ever encounter either vaccine or virus. And so we are unfortunately not only taking innate immunity for granted, but many of us aren't even noticing it and understanding that we may be detracting from it. So, one thing that we should all be paying attention to is young people had terrific immunity to SARS-CoV-2, and that immunity seems to be decreasing. So, why is that? It's too early to say, but one possibility is that the game we are playing is actually trading one thing off for another, and that we will understand only far down the road what cost we have actually paid for the immunity that we've generated.
Thanks, Brett. How you doing? Are you easing back into this clubhouse conversation after being away for a few weeks? How's it feeling?
Feels pretty good. I mean, Clubhouse is a weird environment, and I'm not exactly sure. It wasn't my plan to stay away from it, but something did keep me away. And anyway, yeah, it's certainly marvelous in many regards, and it's also a live fire exercise in other ways.
Right? Are you ready for another question?
Of course.
Great. Okay. Just reminding everyone, and thanks, George. It's really difficult to do it in one breath, but so we can get as many questions as possible, we'll probably take one more and then maybe move the subject on. Just want to welcome to the stage Jan. Um, Jan, do you have a question for Brett?
I do, and I have to say just super quickly, this is the best kind of explanation of the evidence for a lab escape origin that I've come across, and I've looked a lot in a lot of different places. So thank you for that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Um, so yeah, we covered this back in April of 2020, but not nearly to the, of course, we didn't know nearly what we know now and so forth. But okay, so here's my question. I'm kind of more curious about the uh, lockdown, what you think, based on everything you've said. I think you probably have a lot of thoughts about on the lockdown approach where you lock down, a broad swath of the population versus something like the Great Barrington Declaration approach, where you do focused protection and you open up to all the people that have, as you described, basically very, very low risk. In a word, that's my question.
Sure. So I often find myself with a position that, if you look at it just right, it has something to piss off absolutely everybody. And so my position is we were way too relaxed about lockdown, and so we've got way too much. And that in effect, we should be looking at this, we should be taking a calculus approach. And the idea is what you want is to minimize the area under the curve, where the area is, degradation of civil liberties. But the degradation of civil liberties might ultimately have been massively reduced if we had taken a very aggressive approach for 6 weeks, right? Like really aggressive beyond anything that anybody did. And if we had done that, what you could have had is the virus could bounce around inside of households as it does, burn itself out, not completely, but mostly. 6 weeks is enough for several sequential cases to run their full infectious course. And then you could use high quality track and trace. And, if you had a municipality in which control was not achieved, you could isolate that municipality, but the rest of us could have gone back to normal living. So that's one part of it. I would say we should have been much more aggressive, much earlier, and then we shouldn't be putting up, you're probably getting 20% of the value of lockdown at 80% of the cost. It's an 80-20 thing. And I think that's what we ended up doing. And I'm not happy about it. But the other thing, and maybe more important, Heather and I have been screaming as loudly as we can do in a polite form about the fact that the outside environment appears to be almost completely safe. Now, I have to say, I point this out with some trepidation because evolutionarily speaking, there's no reason that that has to continue to be true. Any day of the week, we could discover that some COVID variants have learned the trick of being spread outside. But so far, it doesn't seem to have happened. And that means that for the last year, the following odd fact has apparently been the case. The world is more than 99% safe, and we have treated it as if it is 100% dangerous. I find this stunning. We should have used the outside environment as a way to normalize our interaction as much as possible. And we should have realized that it was the novelty of our indoor environments that was actually putting us in danger. Now, that's not a perfectly satisfying solution to anything because, of course, in the temperate zones, it gets cold in the winter. You don't have the choice to really live outside. But as much as possible, people should have been unmasked outside, exercising caution, but not they should have been doing as much normal living as possible so we wouldn't be all so fatigued with COVID lockdown measures. And because we didn't do that, now we're going to be very reluctant participants in whatever measures are necessary. So, yeah, I think the short answer to your question is I'm very frustrated with what we did, and I think we wasted a tremendous amount of opportunity.
I would agree with you, Bret. And look, I see Jan. Jan wants to come up, and look, Jan, I'm going to let you up. You have a follow-up quick comment, but please make it quick because we have a tremendous amount of hands raised, and I want to get as many people up as possible and move the conversation on. Jan, yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, and so I just wanted my quick comment is, and perhaps this is because of my long time ago background in evolutionary biology myself. I'm glad to hear I'm not as insane as I've been imagining myself to be. Hearing you say all these things, seeing you've given this deep consideration to these questions as you have. I guess my question is this. Early on, I think until mid-January, we were even being told by the WHO that there was no human-to-human transmission. Even as we know a lot, we knew there was something that was emerging. We knew. So, I mean, there was just this wild amount of
One breath,
disinformation.
Jan. One breath. There's a lot of people waiting.
There was a wild amount of disinformation early on, right? So, from all sorts of places, let's say. So, how could we possibly deal with this in an intelligent way, or how could we in this type of environment, even in the future, frankly?
Thanks, Jan.
Well, I don't think it's as hard as we make it out to be. That's not to say that you can do it really well, but in some sense, I think Heather and I left a record of how one navigates a question like this. Because we did this live, initially it was twice a week. We were looking at the literature as it emerged, analyzing it as best we could. And so you can see the evolution of a model for avoiding COVID, right? Initially, Heather and I talked about the precautions that we took in touching objects and how we dealt with things like going from the car to a store, back to the car, into the home with our kids. As it became clear that for whatever reason, COVID does not transmit by fomite, that is, by surface, we jettisoned all that stuff. And basically, in the end, what we were left with was a model that's very effective at preventing people from contracting COVID at minimal level of disruption to our lives, right? So we have been talking since, I don't know, March of last year about the interesting fact, which was at first just an empirical fact, about the effective volume of a room and its effect on transmissibility. So as you get into a car with somebody of unknown disease status, you're taking some of the biggest risks you can possibly take. Roll the windows down; those risks drop spectacularly. So that's a trick that somebody needed to say out loud, right? Think very carefully before you get into a car during this pandemic. If you're going to get into a car, roll down the windows and explain why you're doing it. And you can do the same trick with your house. If you have to have somebody in your house to do work and you don't know their virus status, open all the windows. Yep, it's going to cool your house right down in the winter, and that's not pleasant, but it's a hell of a lot better than taking the risk, and the peace of mind is well worth it. So I would say smart people looking at the evidence and not listening to authorities that were obviously corrupted and deranged resulted in a rapid construction of a highly effective model. And, that was possible. Everybody could have done that. But I think the problem is we have an instinct to look for the people who know, and nobody knew at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. I want to, before we move to the next question, I do want to talk very briefly because I'd said we were about a shared frontier. You and I talked about it briefly, well, quite at length actually last week, and the notion that if humanity continues down our current path, we won't survive, and that we got into this predicament through an evolutionary process. And I asked you about whether you said it didn't have a name and could we give it a name, and that name be the shared frontier. But I think you wrote about accepting a few things, three things. Given similar circumstances, people are basically alike, is one. An excellent world is possible, but perfection is not an option, is two. And the future cannot be designed, it will have to be discovered. Will we discover some answers in The Hunter Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, the book that you and Heather have written that will be out in September?
Yeah, I of course don't know what the reception to the book is going to be. My fondest hope is that people will take it as an exercise in campfire, where we introduce our model and present it in a way that will allow people to participate in that conversation and to push back in places where they think we've got it wrong and to extend it where they think we're onto something interesting. So our hope is that it sparks a kind of conversation that we do not see widely. It does attempt to sketch a path towards what we call a fourth frontier. I would imagine that that term would be completely obscure to everyone in the room, but uh, suffice it to say that a fourth frontier would be an architected steady state that satisfied basic human needs so that human beings were not driven to pursue the kinds of things that ultimately result in us either destroying the environment on which we depend or destroying other populations in order to procure more of what we perceive ourselves to need. And I do believe that it is possible to get there. I'm worried that the nature of our current mode of policymaking isn't going to allow it, which is part of what the unity movement was about. Can we bootstrap a new mode of political interaction that would allow us to move in the direction that we actually need to if we're going to survive the 21st century?
If the president called you tonight and said, "Look, we have a crisis. We need a shared frontier or a fourth frontier think tank. Uh, give me your best people. Who are they? Who can you put together? Which people would you pick, Brett?" And I'm going to bring up the next question in a minute. But who would you pick? Who would you place on that think tank?
You know, it's one of these things. I'm not prepared to give you the list, even though, in some sense, I spend a lot of time thinking about who's on that list. And I would say, rather than name individuals, I would say there are certain characteristics that that are key, that effectively are prerequisites. And you know, you could take some people who are the smartest in the world, but if they're not prepared to subjugate their own ambition to their ambition on behalf of their lineage. That is to say, if they're not prepared to put aside their own ascent in order to make it possible for there to be humans here 200 years from now, then it doesn't matter how smart they are. They can't really be in on that discussion. But there are lots of people who do have really powerful insight, high capacity to think, play well with others, which is, you know, it's tough. There are some people who I hold in high esteem who don't do that one so well, and I would be tempted to figure out how to bring them into such a conversation without allowing their, you know, their social myopia to drive the conversation into chaos. But really, we're talking about a navigation question, and we're talking about a philosophy of prototyping in which we're not really saying who knows enough to spell out what we're to do. It's a more basic set of questions than that, and you know, in general, it's not so hard to find the people who have the mental horsepower. It's not even hard to find the people who have the mental horsepower and the moral instincts to participate in such a conversation. The problem is those people have in general been sidelined or had their focus narrowed by the incentives that surround our current institutions.
This is the Respondent Club. We're here with evolutionary biologist Professor Bret Weinstein and Amanda Patterson. Welcome to the stage. Do you have a question for Bret?
Yes, thank you, Greg. Hi, Bret.
Hi, Amanda.
Hey, my question is, you mentioned earlier that you're concerned about a variant that the vaccine does not protect against adequately, and specifically that we may not respond appropriately to it and do what needs to be done. And I'm curious as to what you think should be done in that situation.
Well, so first of all, this doesn't start for me with COVID. I have been marveling for decades at the lax way in which we treat infectious disease in an age where you can hop on an airplane and you can transmit a virus across an ocean in a matter of hours, right? That has never seemed rational to me. What is the cost of a variant of the flu jumping an ocean? Right? It's almost uncountable. And yet we treat it as if it's automatic because we all get the flu occasionally. And, it's just, it's so much part of the water that we swim in that we don't think about whether or not we might have an obligation to prevent that from happening. We don't think about the lives that are typically lost because we just sort of assume flu is going to bounce around every year and lives are lost and that's what happens. And, it's nonsense. So, in essence, what I would say is I would like us, I saw for the first time with COVID-19 a proper discussion of how disease transmits from one individual to another, a discussion rich enough for people actually to manage their own interactions. That was really positive, and I would love to see us do it for each disease. And I would love us to take on the responsibility of not making each other sick. I would love us to alter our economies so that they were built so that these things didn't transmit, so sick people didn't feel compelled to go to work because they were afraid of jeopardizing their jobs if they didn't go, that sort of thing. So in the case of a variant, if we spotted a variant that truly did not respond to the immunity created by a prior case of COVID or to the vaccine, the right thing to do would be to see it quickly. We should be looking for it. We should spot it quickly. We should err in the direction of imagining that such a thing is possible. And when we see it, we should isolate whatever landmass it is that has this variant so it doesn't jump to the next one rather than, you kind of notice that there's a variant that's, running rampant in Britain, but by the time you're discussing it in public, it's already found its way across every ocean, right? That's a terrible error. So I would say we have to recognize that we all have a stake in preventing these variants from moving. And you're going to be very unlucky if you're in a place that has the new variant, and that means suddenly, your city or state has to be isolated. But most of the time, you will get the benefit of being in the rest of the world where that variant never makes it if we take an aggressive enough stance to begin with.
Thanks, Bret. And in the interest of your time, I'm going to say we'll take a couple more questions and maybe have a little campfire at the end. But feel free at any moment to leave quietly. It's that button at the bottom left that just to remind you and
The one
everyone.
that's marked leave quietly?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
right.
wondered what that meant.
Let's see. I think we have a question from Jefferson Marks, who let's see, Jefferson. I love hearing Jefferson's dialect. To an Englishman, I hear a lot. Oh, I love your accent. Well, to an Englishman, I love all of the rich American dialects. And when Jefferson speaks, I just love it. Jefferson, you got a question, buddy, in one breath?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it. Hi, Bret. My question is more along what do you think it's we all kind of recognize that the institutions have dropped the ball. I mean, there's a way in which we've all kind of dropped the ball over the course of the last year, but the institutions themselves that we depend on have also dropped the ball. And I've been listening to you for a few years now, and to the Darkhorse podcast this year, and I'm really digging it, man. But what do you reckon the institutions in their ideal state look like? You know, what would they actually look like in order to preserve the kind of inertia that we need the institutions to have, so they don't go chasing butterflies, but that they can still react and contend with these kind of issues?
It's a great question. I'm going to resist trying to do my best Southern accent, and I will just answer your question straight as best I can. The institutions are feeble and corrupt, and this is something that somebody who has contacted these institutions on the inside, if you're paying attention to the right metrics, you can notice this very easily. And you tend to end up sounding like a crank because you're constantly talking about how broken the institutions are when they're actually functioning, well enough to keep the lights on, one day to the next. The problem is, A, the institutions are almost without exception plugged too directly into the market. Now, I'm not anti-market. In fact, I'm a tremendous fan of the power of markets, but I believe that we ought to limit markets to doing jobs that they are good at, and we ought to shield everything that they are in danger of destroying from them. We ought to not ask them to solve problems they're incapable of solving. So, in essence, and this is true, it's actually a fractal kind of an insight, you want your institutions and you want the people who are steering their course to have a priority above their self-betterment. So, in other words, I believe in a concept, I would say it's kind of an extended notion of patriotism. And I would say patriotism is typically, effectively, the love of country. That's how we usually use the term. And what it means is that you place your country's interests symmetrically or above your own. And I think it's a reasonable thing to do, especially if you live in a country that achieves great things, as I do, and as I assume you do. What you want are institutions that are interested in the betterment of their nation or of humanity, and not their own increase in power or influence, right? So, in other words, you don't want cops who aren't interested in making themselves obsolete, right? A good cop should want to see crime decrease so that they become less and less necessary. And anyway, that kind of instinct to actually not worry about preserving the necessity for you to do your job is something that institutions need to do. At the moment, though, our political structure and its close connection with the market has built a kind of dysfunction right into the fabric of governance at every scale. And the result is a kind of lobotomized, clumsy, self-defeating pattern that, of course, sets us up for disasters like the current pandemic. I mean, and that is true irrespective of the origins of the virus. It's true to the 10th power if this is a self-inflicted wound. If we created a supervirus and it escaped from a laboratory and then we failed to control it as a result of political infighting, that's the cautionary tale that you're looking for. That should cause humanity to sit up and say, hey, what are we doing?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I mean, before I bring up the next person with a question, what would you say to the hypothesis that this virus came from China? We know that the CCP restricted internal travel while fighting tooth and nail to prevent any restrictions to the outside, knowing internally the virus was transmissible. And Xi saw what was happening in China and weaponized the virus by kind of saying everyone else can burn with us. Do you think there might be any merit to that, or nah?
Well, I'm hesitant on that because I would say it is properly treated as a hypothesis. I haven't seen the evidence that would say it has the presumption with it. I think the presumption is against it, but I'm certainly open to that possibility. The effect of the virus has been to reveal the fragility of the West at an incredible level. So, I see plausibility there, but I want to see something like evidence before one seriously starts to contemplate such a thing.
Understandable. Before I get to Ned, who's up on the stage with a question, do you speak to Eric about? I would imagine that you speak to Heather about this, but have you spoken to Eric about this? Is there consensus in the Weinstein Hying family?
About what do you mean by this?
Well, vaccines. I mean, is Eric on the same page as you with regards to vaccines?
Well, you've hit one of the few places I think I just sort of structurally can't go. Heather and I are public enough about what we think and why we think it, that I won't speak on her behalf in this case, but I'm happy to repeat things that we've said and made clear. But the problem is because all of these positions carry a significant danger with them, I'm not really comfortable shoving anyone into the fray, even if I know them to be someone who would march into the fray on their own. So, yes, I do talk about these things with Eric, but you'll have to ask him what his perspective is.
Fair answer. Thank you, Brett. Ned, it's good to have you on the stage. Do you have a question for Brett?
Hey guys, yeah, thanks for having me. Brett, been a while. Nice to cross paths with you again.
Hi, Ned.
So my question is, do you view yourself as an educator on Darkhorse and in your kind of public media appearances, YouTube, podcasts, etc., in the same way you did and do in the classroom? And then the other question is, why a book when you already have so much reach? What's the marginal value of a book beyond what you're already doing?
Both good questions. On the one hand, I see the role as podcaster and public speaker in very similar terms. But on the other hand, the thing about Evergreen and the weird structure that the founders put in place was that it created an environment in which a professor was empowered to teach anything they wanted in any way they wanted. And what people probably don't know is that a professor taught one class at a time, full time. Students took one class at a time, full time, and the classes could go on for a full year. So this allowed me to know every student in the classroom well, for them to know me, and for me to, in fact, teach individually to them. I knew each person's blind spots, and it made for a teaching environment that I've never seen duplicated anywhere else. And, it's sort of the one thing I miss about the place. I can't do that on Darkhorse. Darkhorse is much closer to a traditional environment just out of necessity because, if 4,000 people tune in to watch, I don't know who they are. So it's closer to standing at a podium and talking to a large sea of faces. But in terms of what I would like to be the case, yeah, I do see it. I see myself in the role of educator, and I'm actually surprised at how well Heather and I have been able to adapt what we did in the classroom to 25 or 50 people at a time to an environment of thousands to tens of thousands. And I like it quite a bit. As for why a book, well, in part, one wants to deliver an important message where people will receive it. And some people see books in a particular light that makes them the conduit for such a thing. And so, it's sort of like, why would you add a book? Well, because it made sense to add one. And I also think that there are just things that can't be developed in discourse, right? They have to be laid out so that people can go back and read a paragraph several times. And, get the meaning of it before they move on, and by the end of the chapter you've got the meaning that we intended, but there's no telling how long it took you to get through it, that kind of thing. So I see some real value in it that isn't duplicated by the other modes.
Thanks, Bret. Thanks for the questions, Ned. This is the respondent with Professor Bret Weinstein. We are here on Clubhouse. I'm going to open up the stage in a little while to have a bit more of a campfire setting on the stage. And maybe you can stick around for a bit longer, Bret, but I've already mentioned, and for those of you who are new to the audience, I've reminded Bret that there is the Leave Quietly button, so please don't feel that you have to stick around for an extended period of time. But we're going to take a couple of very quick more questions before we do open up the campfire stage. And Creon, it's great to have you on the stage. Just a reminder, if you can do it in one breath, you're a better man than I. Hi, Creon.
Oh no.
Oh dear, Creon, are you there?
It helps if I unmute. Hey there.
Yes, indeed.
Um, it's been a while. Nice to see you all.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So Bret, I'm going to ask you a question, if you don't mind. That's actually, even though I haven't yet gotten your book, the title of your book has always made me want to ask this question of you and Heather. But since it's you, it'll be you. And I think it's actually I hope it's kind of square in the middle of your exact maximum area of expertise, which is evolution and natural selection, that sort of thing. And so I'm going to it's not going to be philosophy. It's just going to be sort of biology. So here's a question. We have, so the hunter-gatherer's guide to the 21st century, that makes me think that what we should be doing is, looking back to our origins and our evolution to understand how to live right and what to do, how to navigate our world. Okay, so when we come to, let us say, nutrition, but this is just an example of the general question I'm asking, you can say, well, we evolved to eat this way and we evolved under these certain circumstances and our metabolism is as such. And so we might wish to approach, say, a diet or a lifestyle or anything really that is what we evolved to do, like what we were selected for. On the other hand, and this is the real question right here, that was just selecting for gene propagation, right? That was just selecting, that was not, we evolved to eat a certain way or run a certain way. That was not to live maximally long, healthy, happy lives as individuals. That was for some sort of genetic propagation that was being maximized. So I guess my question is, what do we have to tune about the evolutionary arguments? We don't want to throw them out, but we don't want to just follow the evolutionary arguments because that only has to do with genes propagating to the future. It doesn't have to do with necessarily long and healthy and happy lives for the individual. Do you know? You get what I'm saying? I'm sorry, I'm not too articulate about this.
Man, are you going to love this book? Yeah, we we address exactly the set of questions, and it is definitely not a book advocating for paleo everything, right? In fact, one of the things we do is dismantle the idea that there is a paleo environment that constitutes our environment of evolutionary adaptedness, and that we should basically be behaving and eating and romancing in the way that we did back then. It's nothing like that. Our argument is effectively we cannot go back, we must go forward, and we must not let the genes dictate what we categorize as success. That in fact, what the genes have planned for us is completely indefensible. We have to take the reins of our own evolution, and that in effect, selection gave us, in an effort to get us to spread our genes, it awarded us the one tool that will allow us to shut it down, which is consciousness. We can recognize what our program is. We can recognize that although that program is capable of marvelous things, it's also capable of completely despicable things, and that we can rewrite our purpose. We can write a purpose that is, in fact, worthy of us, that augments the things about ourselves that we actually rightly value. And that is exactly not only what we should do, but what we must do if we're going to survive. Because otherwise, lineage against lineage competition is going to keep putting us in situations where we are going to go after each other. And with the level of weaponry and the level of interconnectedness that modernity has thrown at us, we will take a very short ride if we allow the genes to continue to drive.
May I just say one more follow-up statement on this, Brett and Greg, which is that I'm loving it. I'm definitely getting the book and next on the list. But the thing you talked about, that we get to drive, that we get to take control, in a way, I'd just like to put forth, as I'm sure you do, that's the magic. That is like the real magic of the human species. That's the once in a planet thing that has happened now, that we can actually start directing consciously.
Yes, the possibility that we can. And the thing that I struggle with, the bitter pill, is I know of no reason that it is impossible for us to take the reins from evolution, to turn the tables on it, and to effectively write a program that is worthy of our better angels. But I also recognize how unlikely it is that we will do it. That, our inability to see far enough into the future is very likely to cause us to continue to play these games and to sideline every attempt to steer that path. And so I would say I believe it is not too late, but if I had to bet, I bet we're going to screw it up.
Okay, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree, and hopefully I'm right.
Hopefully you're right.
Thanks, Creon. Thanks, Brett. Opening up the stage to be a little bit more campfire, the collective community. I see Will and Five-ish. Will, I wonder if you have a question for Brett.
Hey, yeah. So, Brett, one thing I was thinking as you were talking is it seems like, at least from what I can gather on the work that you're putting out, that you dive into this idea of listlessness a little bit, of something snapping between what kind of motivated us as an internal battery before versus what we're experiencing now. And I'm just curious if you have any deeper insight into that, or anything that you found that we could benefit from listening to.
Well, I think it's in some sense, once you've looked at the following thing, it's almost impossible not to see it and to recognize its implications. And the thing is, human beings have the identical purpose as every other species that has ever evolved, right? You have the same purpose as a fig tree and a mosquito and a liver fluke and COVID-19, right? It's all one purpose. That tells you something about the quality of that purpose, right? It's completely generic, it's uninteresting, it's amoral, and it is unworthy of us. So once you see that, and then you recognize, well, but I don't have to do that, right? I could do something else. I don't have to act to ensure that the number of my genes that are in the next generation is as large as I can make it. I can choose to do something else, right? And in fact, most of us do. People who engage in family planning and don't just, produce children as a result of, baby roulette. We engage in something like this. The hard part, the thing that makes this uncertain that we will jump the gap, is that when we choose to ignore our genetic program, we give a competitive advantage in genetic terms to those who have not sidelined their genetic program. So, in order for humanity to take off the autopilot and take control of our own destiny, we have to do so in a way that does not provide an advantage to those humans that refuse to come along.
Thanks, Brett. Welcome, Cactus Brian and Hannah, to the stage. Five-ish, do you have a question? And can you keep it in one breath? I don't think anyone's done it tonight. I don't know if it's possible, but it doesn't stop us from trying.
I'll certainly do my best. I do have asthma, so if you can grant me some oppression points, I'll do my best to be as quick as I can. There is, just wanted to state something real quick, and then I'll ask my question. in quick succession. There's a CBS News article quoting a Texas trauma surgeon that says it's rare that X-rays from their COVID-19 patients come back without dent scarring, and even 70 to 80% of the time in asymptomatic patients, they showed a severe chest X-ray. So, Bret, I understand you're concerned with potential long-term adverse effects with the mRNA COVID vaccine, but do you not find it irresponsible to communicate these concerns without juxtaposing them to the unknown long-term, potentially permanent adverse effects from the COVID-19 virus itself, lung scarring, neuropathy, fatigue, etc.?
Yes, I would find that irresponsible, which is why Heather and I have spent so much time on that exact issue. So, I would invite everyone to come listen to the conversation. You will find something that probably will offend you right away, and you will find something that will place it in a different context. And so I would say you will never find Heather and me underrating the danger of COVID. And in fact, one of the things that we repeatedly say is as much as we don't know anything about the long-term implications of these vaccines, and it isn't just the mRNA vaccines, it's all of them, we also don't know much about the long-term implications of COVID-19, and they are both very frightening. But what is clear is that the best case, physiologically speaking, is to remain free of COVID and unvaccinated. Would I prefer to be vaccinated than get sick with COVID? Almost certainly. But the downside, the potential downside of these vaccines is significant, including things that we cannot rule out, like autoimmune disorders going forward, loss of innate immunity, which could result in increased likelihood of COVID a year or two from now. All of these things are deserve to be heavily weighted in our calculations. And one of the lessons is we were foolish to allow this to get out of control at the beginning because we would be forced into making terrible choices between vaccines whose long-term implications we know nothing about and diseases that have the capacity to do tremendous damage to the body, even if the case fatality rate is low in the short term.
Thanks,
If I
Bret,
could,
and thank you, Fivish. Just want to keep it moving because there's people who haven't spoken, and I want to be mindful of Bret's time before we get to the kind of campfire popcorn. If we can, Cactus, welcome to the stage. Do you have a question, and can you do it in one breath? I challenge you. It's good to see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to see you too. I think a lot of the Game B people, which I kind of include myself in, uh, find that there's something very different about the evolutionary space between low contact and high contact. For example, in real life, in the evolution of organisms, you tend to have a large distance between organisms, for example, from different continents. So you have some type of ripple effect in the very long term. However, in information spaces, such as if you're looking at memetics, you have almost a complete graph, right? Every data point can essentially reach every data point in maybe one or two transmissions. And I think the core trait that this alters is that it alters the value of adaptability, and it alters the value of kind of the Swiss Army knife approach in terms of gaining various traits. And I think that's exactly what you see with, for example, memes evolving, you could say, to become more incoherent, to have ideologies that essentially can put together the best of both worlds by not making any sense and forcing people to go along with it otherwise. Do you see the similar trait, and does it line up with a kind of evolutionary context instead of just kind of information theoretic context?
Yep, I think I understand your question, and let me just sum it up this way. The reason that our genomes offloaded so much of the evolutionary work to the software part of our minds is because it allows a massive acceleration of the evolutionary process. But the downside of that massive acceleration is that the signal to noise ratio is not high. When you see a structure on an animal, you can be certain that that structure is valuable to the animal. When you see a human being engaged in a behavior, if that behavior goes back thousands of years, you can make the same assumption. But if it's somebody doing something that's only been around for 20 years, you have no way of knowing whether or not it's actually maladaptive or adaptive. So I think you're on the right track, and the very pattern you're describing is there, and it's one that we all need to be cognizant of, because so much of our behavior is is necessarily new, having been built on technologies that simply didn't exist 20, 30 years ago.
Thanks, Cactus, very much. Brian, Brian, I see you on many of Eric's stages. Welcome to this stage. This is the respondent with Bret Weinstein. Do you have a question for Bret?
Yeah, Bret, nice to meet you. I'd love to have you even have the logarithm of the number of appearances your brother's made on my podcast. That'd be an honor. My question is a simple one. Try to keep it to one breath. How far back do we have to go to qualify for as ancient? Many religious traditions are extremely happy people, very full of satisfaction. Life traditions, as you say, go back and maintain for thousands of years. And the Orthodox community is one of those. Obviously, Mormons, Christians, Catholic traditions seem to be quite happy, even with the trappings that you guys speak about in the upcoming book. So interested to know how much of what's old counts as new again. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Well, you got two questions. One is, how long standing does something have to be before we are justified in imagining it must be serving a purpose? And the answer is, it's got to be old, but not that old, right? If, a few hundred years is probably enough for a perfectly pointless, expensive behavior to go extinct. And if you think about the way this works, think about a religion. Pick one, right? A religion involves sectarian difference inside the religion. People adhere to parts of the religion, they jettison other parts. To the extent that some part is valueless and expensive, you would expect those who have jettisoned it to have an advantage. And over time, the religions effectively edit themselves down to those traditions that have a purpose. So it doesn't take, 1,000 years is certainly enough to say that an expensive behavior is probably serving a purpose. However, there's nothing that says that a behavior that was serving a purpose until, the Industrial Revolution is still serving that purpose. And so this has been one of my points to Jordan Peterson, is that although he is quite right to imagine that there is deep meaning and that it is evolutionary inside of the stories that have brought us to the present, that is not the same thing as saying that those stories retain the same meaning with reference to our present circumstances. And our circumstances are so novel that we are effectively doomed to a never-ending game of Chesterton's fence, where we see a lot of things, we don't know what purpose they're serving. It's tempting to throw them out, it's perilous to throw them out, and we have to navigate with extreme caution.
Thank you for the question, Brian. And thank you, Bret. Last question before we open it up. And again, I just want to say thank you for joining us, Bret, in the Respondent Club. It's been a pleasure and is a pleasure having you here. It's always a pleasure speaking to you and with you and listening to your insights. You are a voice in a Darkhorse culture. We need the Darkhorse. You'd explained to me last week the origins of that before we get to Hannah. Maybe you can extemporize on that for a moment. The origins of Darkhorse and what the Darkhorse is.
Sure. The Darkhorse is actually the invention of Benjamin Disraeli. It shows up in a book of his, The Young Duke, and basically the idea is that the Darkhorse is a horse that has been trained in secret by methods that no one knows, and so no one knows how to bet. And so I just simply like the idea of people who come out of nowhere and who are therefore hard to judge. We don't know what they're capable of, and we can hope for the best.
Thank you for that. I think many of us in this room are dark horses.
Indeed.
Hannah, Hannah, it's good to have you with us. Can you do it? One breath, we wonder. But what's your question for Bret?
Hi, Bret. I have two questions. One's very silly. In my profile, it says I am the Mr. Ed of Clubhouse.
I
So I just
noticed
want to
that.
know when you're going to be doing the right thing and changing your podcast to A Horse of Color. And then the second question is a bit more serious. I'm wondering how your Unity project approaches or is having the conversation about the ethics of a good life, maybe versus a long life, to make a very kind of grotesque dichotomy. So, one thing I see about the conversation around vaccines and COVID is the singular narrative of longevity of life and the avoidance of sickness. I see a real medicalization of our society in which our consciousness and our psychology has become narrowly defined to are you sick, are you not, is your life long, is it short? And I just see this as really more than any other issue as an ethical issue and an issue of how should we then live our lives. And I just want to know your thoughts on that and how your project addresses those things.
Well, it's sort of beyond the scope of Unity. Unity is really targeted at actually changing things in the short term. And what you're talking about is a deep philosophical engagement with the question of what should we maximize. And um, I resonate with what you're saying. I think it's perfectly pointless to maximize lifespan, and that you really want a more integrative concept, quality of life. The whole conversation is thoroughly polluted by, I'm sure I'm about to offend people in the room, but by people who believe that we are on the cusp of defeating aging in one way or another, which I absolutely believe we are not. But the very fact that some people hold in their minds the possibility that maximum human lifespan will be changed while they are still around to benefit from it is causing the conversation to be almost unhavable. But in in some sense, I think we don't spend enough time on gratitude, that we need to look at the lives that we have, recognize how precious they are. We need to make more of them. We need to feel less entitled to have them go on forever. And we need to recognize that we also have an obligation to provide that experience, the experience that we were lucky enough to have, a meaningfully liberated life, to as many human beings as we can. And that means we have to stop burning the resources of the planet and rendering our systems fragile, because it's not just us that we imperil. It's all the people who are entitled to get to try their hand at it, who will never get that chance if we blow the place up.
Thanks, Brett. And to Hannah's first question about changing the name of the podcast, I think it's probably too late in the game for that. With the branding and the name is out there, so we'll. This is the respondent with Bret Weinstein. Bret, thank you again for joining us for the amount of time that you've been here. I know at some point you're going to leave quietly. We'll let you decide when that is. I do want to open up the
Now,
stage
how
now
do you
to.
know I'm going to leave quietly?
Well, I'm asking that you leave quietly.
Oh, okay.
Ha ha.
How's that? I asked. I
Fair
like when
enough.
everyone leaves. Well, I mean, you can be the exception, maybe. You don't. I just don't want you to have to feel like you have to stick around.
No,
And
leave quietly is kind of my style. I just wanted to know how you knew.
yeah, well, I, I had a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So look, we'll just open it up and we'll have a little campfire. And I can't promise that I won't tap in with a little. Pithy music piece here and there at the piano, which you haven't experienced, Brett, in some of my lighter-hearted social rooms. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll get the ukulele out, but we'll see. Thank you, everyone, for joining the Respondent Club. This is the Respondent Club, and we're here with Bret Weinstein this evening. Amanda, I see you tapping in, and George. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll go Amanda, then George. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Brett, I have one more question for you. I'm kind of I try to have a positive outlook and optimistic personality. So my question is, what's the best case scenario with this vaccine and the virus?
Oh, well, geez, I thought you were going to ask me what the best case scenario was for humanity. Best case scenario for the vaccine is that it turns out to have negligible long-term implications, that it creates broad enough scale immunity that the combination of people who have had COVID and have therefore achieved immunity through that mechanism and the people who have been vaccinated is sufficient to drive the circulating virus to low enough levels that other measures will allow us to drive it extinct. I mean, that's clearly the best case scenario. I find it unlikely at this point, but I'm rooting for it.
Thank you.
Sure.
And humanity?
Well, the best case for humanity is awesome. We could architect a steady state that satisfied basic human needs so that people did not feel driven to violate the rules, steal from their neighbors, make war, commit genocide, any of the things that people do when they feel the zero sumness closing in. And at that point, were we to have such a steady state, people could effectively be liberated to make very meaningful use of their lives. Effectively, I have to be careful here because it's very easy to hear such a thing as utopian in nature, and I firmly believe that utopia is the worst idea human beings have ever come up with. But were we realistic, were we interested in balancing our competing concerns and surrendering the idea of a perfect future, an excellent future is quite conceivable in the same way that you probably have spring-like conditions in your house every day of the year, and you don't think of that as some sort of violation of the laws of physics, right? It isn't one. We know how we do it. We use energy to adjust the temperature in your building, and so in effect, we could do the same trick for a larger set of concerns. We could create spring-like conditions that would liberate you to pursue things that matter, whether that's creating, art of significance, whether it's discovering things about the universe we don't yet know, whether it is facilitating, deep interaction between people, whatever it might be, we could liberate people to do that instead of having them toil away on stuff that's in the long run of no consequence.
Thanks, Amanda. George.
Hey, Brett. I like so much of the discussion you had, not because I didn't have disagreements. I have large disagreements with a lot of the things that you said in sort of in the science, but that's really in the weeds, right? And this isn't the place to go into the weeds. But one thing, by the way, I totally disagree. I mean, totally agreed with was the idea of outdoors. I've not politely been screaming at my friends for over a year that it's just ludicrous to think that I need to wear a mask on the streets of Chicago. But let's put that aside too. Uh, I'm curious as to what your thought is about how we increase people's auditory ability to listen with greater nuance. So while I'm sitting here listening to Bret Weinstein, a guy with all this reputation on both sides of sort of conservative liberal, I'm disagreeing with some of the things you're saying, but I'm able to agree with a bunch of the other things that you're saying, right? Because I don't listen to this sort of trope of Bret Weinstein. I listen to what the hell you're saying. How do we improve people's ability to listen to what folks are actually saying, as opposed to thinking they've already heard them and dismissing sort of wholesale what folks say, as opposed to saying, okay, I agree with that for these reasons, I disagree with that for these reasons, et cetera. What do you think about how we can improve the ability of people, let's start with Americans, to hear with greater nuance?
Well, yeah, this actually does make me hopeful because what I've found, and maybe even to my surprise, is that mode of interaction you're describing, it happens naturally given conditions that facilitate its emergence, and people love it, right? So we come to understand ourselves as petty and unnuanced, but given the opportunity to have deeper conversations and to engage somebody, most of us are actually kind of delighted to find that somebody that we might initially have had suspicions about turns out to be in a position to inform us of something we didn't know. So, what I would say is, if you can create the conditions, even in a small room, where people discover that that's possible, then you're already answering the question. Then it is happening and people will spread it. And I would use as an analogy, if you think about what television used to look like, right, in the 80s or 90s, right? Television gave the impression that people were almost impossibly stupid and had very short attention spans and would accept drivel and probably weren't capable of dealing with much better. And then you change the business model, and people end up paying for television in advance, and the advertisers disappear. And suddenly it turns out that people are fascinated by these incredibly intricate narratives that they're capable of following and that actually create a kind of shared culture. And the point is, we were capable of that all along. It was just the stupid business model that caused television to be poison, and it didn't have to be that way. So I think the thing is, people, not everyone, there are bad people, but people are generally good, and they are generally interested in hearing what's being said on the other side. And it's just very, that mode is excellent, but it's fragile. And so what you're really detecting is the fact that that mode fails regularly because of the circumstance. It only takes one person to poison a room, right? That means a room of a certain size is almost certain to have somebody in it who will play that role. So pay careful attention to what rooms are capable of playing the game you're talking about and let people get addicted to it, I think is the short answer.
Thanks, Bret.
Brad, you're not talking about me, are you?
No, I'm not talking about anybody I've heard speak here tonight.
I wonder, tap in if you would like to make a comment or ask a question. Otherwise, I'll just fill in with, we're here in the respondent, discussing with Bret Weinstein, saving humanity. We're having civil discourse time now. Okay, it happened, Bret. I mean, there it was.
Hey, man, I
What can I
forgive you.
say? Oh, come on. Oh,
That's awesome. I
the
forgive you.
cuts deep. Oh, very good. All right, Ned, Ned, go ahead. Make a comment other than forgiving me.
Yeah, Brett, how has your attitude toward and appetite or lack thereof for conflict and controversy changed from Evergreen to your most famous clubhouse room in February? I didn't want to read too much into your having departed clubhouse, but you kind of have some kind of come to Jesus moment about how you're spending your time with people screaming at you directly, or how are you thinking about that?
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that, but no, I don't think that had anything to do with it, actually. If I can be frank, Clubhouse, I think because of what's good about it, it was having a really negative impact on my life because, there's something about the fact of a conversation of many people that nobody in your life can see but you. So you're sort of tuned into this vibrant room full of real people talking in real time, and that's great. But what's it doing to your interaction with your family, who's actually, present in the same building? And so, anyway, I was finding that hard to manage, and I think I still don't know how to do it, and I think probably different people have different skill sets. But no, it wasn't in any way a response to that crazy incident on Clubhouse that caused me to walk away. And I didn't even plan to walk away. It just kind of happened. There was something that kept me from coming back. As for how my attitude toward conflict has changed, I think I have unusual immunities. Apparently, I have unusual immunities. I can endure conflict without taking it personally better than most people, and I also feel some obligation to to say what needs to be said if I know that the reason it's not being said is that people will be challenged and intimidated and stigmatized for saying it. So I sort of feel an obligation to use the immunities that I have to say what otherwise is not being voiced, because otherwise those who would shut down conversation are in too good a position to steer what we all get to engage with. And I think that hasn't changed. There are moments at which I feel like, really, is this, I was sure we had hit rock bottom, and yet the conversation is still getting worse. So, there are moments that I don't feel terribly tolerant of it, but in general, I don't think my attitude toward it has changed too much in the last 4 years.
You said something interesting to me last week as well, Brett, about you reminded me of the summertime. To George's point about being outside and masks, and I talked with Heather on the respondent about being in nature, and I think that is a great restorative healer with this social distancing that many of us have been experiencing this past year. Just get outside, to look at plants, trees, feel the breeze, smell the sounds, listen to the sights. I mean, just be in nature is a great healer, right?
Well, I would say one thing beyond that. I agree, and I'm a nature junkie. So yeah, get out in nature and just go look at all of the miracles that you're ignoring every day. Right, they're out there. On the other hand, I also think outside is the loophole. Right, we are all walking around feeling jeopardized by a disease that any other person might be carrying. And it is having a huge impact on how we understand ourselves as social beings. And the idea that you can go outside and have normal interactions with people. I mean, just think of the absurdity. Somehow we think of this as a virus and it could be anywhere. But in some sense, it's the buildings. I don't know why it's the buildings. Maybe that's because if it turns out this came from a laboratory, maybe that's the reason that it's the buildings that are so damn dangerous. But it's the buildings, stupid. And if it's the buildings, you can go outside anytime you want and have a good laugh with whoever you want about the fact that the buildings are now a problem and that puts us all in an awful predicament. But, go outside, flirt, fall in love, whatever you need to do. Just do it outside and you're pretty safe.
Yeah, and to that, I was going to finish up by saying, when I say summertime, you reminded me of being at school, and that we get summertime off. We leave school, and you'd mentioned that just maybe taking a break from Clubhouse and getting outside, and maybe having a little bit more of a break from the pressures of life. I don't know if you feel that as a professor, having been in higher learning for a while. Is that part of your kind of annual circadian rhythm where it kicks in summertime or not?
Well, first of all, I mean, as I think you probably know about me, I hated school. I detested it. And that was true up until the point that I was the professor and I was capable of making a school environment that I thought was pretty cool, right? But that was very late in life for me. And until that point, summer was the only thing that made school tolerable. The fact that there was this giant break that was going to come with glorious weather and you could go out and do fun things and see amazing stuff. And so anyway, yeah, I see it as really important. And Heather and I, we took to saying winter is coming before last summer came to an end, because we knew that the combination of COVID and being driven inside by the temperature was going to be terrible for people who we share the northern hemisphere with. And I do feel like we tried to warn them because it was pretty clear. And as summer is going to dawn here soon, I feel like warning them again because it's going to be back. And don't forget, anytime you want, even in the winter, you can go outside and take a break from COVID, because for whatever reason, it's not spreading out there.
Just real fast, why do you think we did such a bad job of explaining that. The bioengineering of it's fairly straightforward. Everything from wind to dose to UV, it's fairly straightforward. Why do you think we did such a bad job of communicating that outside was, and we've got studies on this from China, from the UK, that looked at outdoor versus indoor. I mean, the information's there. What are your thoughts on how we failed so dramatically to communicate this?
I think there are two reasons, and one of them I would say is organic, and the other one is political. The organic one is, and I know this from my own the dawning of understanding of COVID that I went through, which is all of us, even those of us who have studied biology carefully and at a high level, we are all sometimes victims of the drawings in our textbooks. And so there's a drawing in every textbook that describes how a virus invades a cell. And it is completely misleading with respect to what actually goes on with not just COVID, but many different viruses. And it has to do with things like dosage, right? Dosage doesn't really get a role in that cartoon in your textbook, right? That cartoon explains how a virus enters a cell. It does not explain how a virus gets past your innate immunity into your cells. And it sort of explains from the last step. And so the recognition that something like the effective volume of the room you're in adjusts how long you would have to be there before you had encountered enough COVID for it to matter, that's counterintuitive if you've learned your biology well, right? So you need to learn your biology really well to understand why the drawing in the textbook is wrong. It's not incorrect, but it's so incomplete as to be misleading. So that's the organic part, is that we're all a bit misinformed, and you had to really be paying attention in order to discover that your model didn't fit the data you were seeing. And that was really what happened to Heather and me, was we kept encountering this data about dose. And it's like, dose is telling us that what we thought we knew isn't right. But the second thing is the politics. And we live in an environment in which everybody's in this zero-sum mindset all the time, and they can't resist taking whatever advantages happen to be, within their grasp. And so people basically took the opportunity to look down on other people, and you divided the world into two wrong groups. There were the anti-mask people who thought masks were bogus and they were just an attempt of some people to control others. And you had the pro-mask people who thought any time they observed you without a mask, they were capable of seeing a moral defect. And they were just both wrong. So the second one of these is easier to address. We have to stop behaving that way. And we have paid an awful price for the politics surrounding COVID that we didn't need to, because really COVID should have united us all. As for the other part, we need to get experts who are more willing to acknowledge when something surprises them and willing to navigate what the surprises that they see might imply, rather than pretending that they are possessing of encyclopedic knowledge and that it is, it is perfect in its nature, because it isn't. We're all learning.
Hey,
Yeah, can I
can I
put?
chime in? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Creon.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I'll
yeah,
go afterwards.
okay, thanks.
Sure, let's go Creon then Cactus.
Okay,
Thanks.
This is good, because this brings us back to a topic we were addressing earlier, right? The institutions topic. So here's something that I'm wondering about as we try to make a better world and move forward and evolve and all this stuff. Why is it, and how might we change it? Why is it that the institutions and the authority figures and all this in across the board are, they never will say, I've changed my mind, I might have been wrong, I've learned something new? Why is it that that is just um, off the table in these institutions, to ever admit that you have got new information, and that you were uncertain before, you're still uncertain now, but in general, to ever, why do people think that admitting that they were wrong, or that they might have been wrong, is a sign of weakness when it is actually a sign of strength?
I think there are two general classes of reason here also. One is the pattern of selection chooses people to lead these institutions who don't have this kind of strength of character. In other words, it favors something that is in tension with that kind of intellectual caution and humility that you're describing. So how amazing is it to discover that Dr. Fauci is not only wrong about all sorts of stuff, but he turns out to be a villain in the story of gain of function research, right? The guy who's telling us what to think about this pandemic turns out to be one of the people who may have contributed to the lifting of restrictions on gain of function research that may have caused the pandemic in the first place. I mean, that's an amazing plot twist. But in some sense, it's not surprising because the character traits that cause somebody to be indifferent to the danger of this kind of research are also the kinds of character traits that put them in a position to reach the highest levels of power. So that's a big important part of it. But the second part is that even when good people are at the heads of these things, we put them in a defensive mode that when any of us find ourselves in it is not conducive to that kind of nuance, right? We're so ready to crucify people for their errors that people are not ready to be candid with us as their opinions change. And in fact, they may rationalize themselves into holding on to a position too long because they're frightened about the social consequences of admitting that they didn't have it right in the first place.
Yeah, just very quickly, Brett. I remember almost a year ago when I launched The Respondent, Stephen Fry was my first guest, and he talked about doubt and nuance. And he said, that any virologist or epidemiologist who is certain does not know. They are not an expert. And I think that's one of maybe the biggest challenges of this is that it's fluid. It's a fluid situation, but the propensity for experts within governance to speak factually and get it completely wrong. To your point about Dr. Fauci, the villain of the piece, it's not populist to say that. And what cancel culture? I mean, people speak out and they're done. Bye bye. We don't see them. So it's almost like there's a group of heretics and outliers who are coming together to perhaps speak more sense, or at least have non-censorious nature.
Yeah, I mean, this is the era of heretics, or you can call them dark horses, or lone wolves, or heterodox thinkers, or whatever you want. But there's a reason that unlikely people, and I think I count myself in this category, unlikely people are showing up and accumulating large followings, and it's because not being full of shit counts for a huge amount in a world that is so drenched in crap. And so I would also just say, and I probably should bow out here in a
Leave
moment or two,
quietly.
but yeah, leave quietly, exactly. But I would say just as a useful tool, when people are expressing certainty about things in which they really shouldn't have certainty, I think it is always fair to ask the question, what do you think the chances that that's true actually are, right? And if somebody says, oh, this virus, it definitely came from nature, you want them to say, you say, well, okay, what do you think the chances are that it came from nature? And if they say 100%, the answer is, okay, well, you just told us we're not having a serious analytical conversation, right? If they say 98%, then at least we know what we're talking about, right? So the willingness, and I do this even when I don't talk out loud about percentages, in my own mind, privately, I think, not only what do I expect the truth to be in this case, but how confident am I of what I believe? And that exercise is, it is the root of nuance, right? You know how likely you think you are to be wrong, and that way when the evidence starts to accumulate that you are wrong, you know where to file it.
Greg, if you don't mind, I haven't had a chance to ask Brett anything. Can I talk before Cactus?
I want to be mindful of Brett's time. So as we, and I had said we'll go to Cactus and then you, Wayne, but I do want to say, Bret, if you have to leave quietly, which I understand you may have to, I just want to first of all say thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here, to re-enter the platform. I hope re-entry wasn't too challenging, and thank you for your forgiveness as I tried to introduce a little campfire song. It wasn't my best. I shall try harder, Professor Weinstein.
No, I liked it well enough. And thank you, Greg, for hosting this. It was a great conversation. You're an excellent host, and these questions have been excellent too, which reminds me of the predicament that Clubhouse can put a person in. So maybe I'll do one more question, and then I will leave quietly as you keep pointing out I can do.
Well, in the interest of Cactus, I'm going to ask if we may allow Wayne to ask the question, just because you have asked the question, and that may be an unpopular decision, but hopefully you'll allow my indulgence and excuse me for that. Wayne, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I did listen to your respondent podcast with Heather that came out, I think, earlier this week. It was great. Bret, thank you for Darkhorse podcast. It's helped save me during COVID lockdown where I've been isolated because the noise to signal ratio was so different than most of the places I found, in the sense that there was a lot more signal that I appreciated. And I appreciated being treated like an adult. In that vein, my question to you is this. Um, your public network has obviously expanded greatly, whether it be from Bill Maher on one side or Tucker Carlson on the other. I imagine you've had a similar extension in your private network, something analogous to your brother's connection with Peter Thiel, I would say. With the extension in your private network and your contacts with the elites, what is the belief that they seem to have that you are the most surprised by? Again, that private network you've extended among the elites, and what is their belief or value that you did not expect until you met them all?
That's an interesting question, and you're right. The number of people who Heather and I are now in contact with, who are deeply enmeshed in the inner workings of the world, it's shocking, and it is revealing. On the one hand, it becomes very clear very quickly that there are no adults in charge. There are lots of people I would say are adult in nature, but it is quite clear there are no adults in charge, and that spooks people who are capable of seeing it. On the other hand, I see kind of two groups amongst the elite. I see one group that has a kind of confidence that I don't understand that things will work themselves out. I think I know why they're wrong, but maybe they're right, and I hope they're right. And then there's another group that has recognized what our trajectory implies about where we're headed and is basically committed. Each of the people who have had this recognition are each committed to doing what they can to try to shift the odds. And I find that group more natural. It's, it does require, I think, a willingness to look into the abyss and to be okay with it. That's a skill I possess, I think. But but anyway, yeah, I see those two groups. I see people who would tell you things are not as dire as one might imagine based on a narrow analysis, and then I see lots of other people who would say almost the reverse. And, actually the two groups get along surprisingly well.
Thank you, Wayne, very much. And as Bret leaves quietly, we'll keep the room open, um, and maybe discuss some of the conversation. I wonder if I'm just going to tap out and allow someone to tap in. This is the respondent. Thank you, Bret, again for being here tonight. Please give my best to Heather, and I look forward to seeing you and talking with you soon.
I sure will. Thanks, Greg, and thanks everybody else.
Nay, Bret,
Thank you
nay.
so much for
Thank you.
being here, Bret.
Thanks, Fred.
Nice to hear your voice.
Yeah, I think I just want to offer a counter hypothesis, or maybe a bundling of everything in an actually kind of Eric Weinstein sort of way. I think the threads that go between why politically institutions have failed to deal with COVID and the personal failures to deal with COVID uh, extend along the following line, which is that people tend to look for solutions to the problem of having to think about COVID instead of the solution of actually having COVID. And so you see a extremely high premium or an extremely high value placed in solutions that can be put into binary forms, right? You wear the mask. You always wear the mask, and there is no kind of nuance there. You shoot for herd immunity on the other side, and there's kind of no attention paid to the consequences of that. And so you get these kind of immediately applicable things that don't have to work in tension with any other type of decision making. That plays incredibly well to the sort of fast brain type of approach where people are using categories, using kind of just a flowchart of definitions in order to try to figure out what they're going to do in order to symbolically fight COVID, instead of that kind of very real recognition that there are complex thoughts to be had, which is, I think, what Bret, what everyone in this kind of loose collection of movements is looking forward to. And so the other question is why is that the case? And something else that Bret has talked about, and I think we've touched briefly in this conversation, is that kind of ad model, that kind of attention hemorrhaging that occurs very frequently, and it's just a very nice line of that causing the disinterest, causing the black and white thinking, and then finally leading to this failure to kind of personally understand or put together the pieces, and that kind of model is very useful for unifying all of these ideas about COVID failure.
Thanks, Cactus, and thank you for allowing Wayne, just seceding the space and allowing Wayne. I know you wanted to ask that question of Bret, so I appreciate you positing that. And I think that speaks to the nuance and the uncertainty and the ever shifting nature of these conversations means that we have to take some time. I think this is probably why the advent of the long form podcast came about, outside traditional news media that has become more about the sound bites and ratings and sensationalism. So I really appreciate that. I wonder if, Masha, we haven't heard from you. It's good to see you on the stage, or anyone else who'd like to tap in. I'm going to tap out for a little while and just allow the conversation to be a bit more organic and maybe reflective on some of the comments Bret made.
I tapped out for a moment to go listen to something specifically that happened between Fauci and Rand Paul today, and I was going to ask Bret if he'd seen it, but by the time I came back, he was leaving quietly. So,
He had seen it.
oh, had he? I missed what
Oh,
he said
yes.
about it. Bummer.
Oh, well, you can, you can, I think you can look on Twitter for Bret's comments about that.
Oh,
He,
Twitter.
I think he had made the comment. I think he actually posted the clip, if I remember correctly. And his comment was, this camera angle doesn't allow us to see if Dr. Fauci's pants are on fire or if his fingers are crossed. But do note his sense of urgency in replacing his mask at the end, presumably to conceal his suddenly expanding nose.
All right, I shall consider going to Twitter today. I was really hoping to avoid it, but that seems like it's worth it.
So I would like to add something to Cactus's comment and to the general spirit of the comments about what's going on behind the scenes with COVID. I think Michael Lewis has a book coming out that's dealing with a lot of the same stuff. I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify this, but at least from my line of work, here's what I might notice. What if it's just a really, really complicated problem that is requiring coordinated action among an entire global community, and we just cannot coordinate our actions with other people very well. It is a social technology that we are not ready for. And that really is the simplest understanding of the problem. I know that we love to over intellectualize things and to pretend to have, really great root cause analysis of everything down to the final end category number. But what if we're just not good at coordinating our actions with other people? And that is the test of our time. If we are to be people of our time, people of our age, we have to learn how to coordinate our actions with a global community, not just a tribe of people that we hunt with and sit around the campfire with at night. But our tribe is much larger.
Yeah, I think that's more or less right, but just stopping the analysis at that is kind of. I mean, it's not even exclusive to anything that was talked about before, right? The collective action problem is certainly like one of the root causes, I think, but um, that doesn't limit us in any way, right? We can still try to look deeper. We can still try to seek those further answers, and none of that puts out of the domain of wanting to find a solution to the collective action problem that you just described.
Well, yeah, but that's a tricky thing, right? So, I mean, I deal in very complicated root cause problem solving. So I understand the issue and what I said, but you know the halo effect, right? So some company makes a lot of money in the stock market and they go public, and all of a sudden all the business writers look in on how they handled their parking space policies and they try to copy those because surely that was connected to their success. I think there's kind of an opposite thing that happens too, though, when everything just goes sideways. Okay, when all the springs, you know, jump out of the back of the watch case, and we go, oh shit, now we have a big problem, and there's springs everywhere on the floor. We got to clean this thing up. There's almost a reverse halo effect where we say, well, wait, hang on, how did that guy think through it, or how did that woman, how did she assess the problem? Oh wait, Dr. Fauci did this. Oh wait, the CDC said this, and there's almost this false attribution problem where, I mean, and I hear it here where I am, just in my area right now, which is Texas for my work, and at a very medically minded city, by the way, a very advanced technological city. There is so much boogeyman behind in every closet, monster under every bed, liar behind every article. It's almost, I feel like I'm living in the time of the witch hunts taken to some great exponent where everybody knows exactly why it's not working. And I'm dealing even with those who deal with primary root cause research. And you know what? It just hits me as kind of halo modeling. Sometimes the answer isn't as complicated as all of that.
I want to welcome Jeff